Hello, everybody, and welcome to our second Introduction to Sociology statewide synchronous session for the spring 2015 semester. My name is Matthew Howell. I am the full-time sociology instructor at the Valparaiso campus. If you need to contact me there, you can reach me at mhowell1@ivytech.edu. That's MHOWELL1@ivytech.edu. Feel free to email me there with any questions you may have regarding the contents of this lecture. For the second week, we're going to be covering chapters 2 and 3 today. Chapter 2 takes a look at sociological research and methods, and chapter 3 takes a look at culture and begins to define some of the terms we'll be using when we examine culture. So let's begin with chapter 2, sociological research. Some of the things we're going to be looking at here: what is the scientific method? We'll be taking a look at the major research designs, ethics of research. We'll look at feminist methodology or a feminist approach to doing research, technology and sociological research. We're going to examine social policy and sociological research, how they can interact, looking specifically at the study of human sexuality. Begin to try to understand how to interpret statistics, tables, graphs, the information that they're trying to communicate to us. Take a look at writing a research report. So, some of the questions we're going to be trying to answer. How do sociologists go about setting up a research project? How do they ensure that the results of the research are reliable and accurate? Can they carry out their research without violating the rights of those they study? So, if you remember from last lecture, if you have listened to that, we talked about sociology being practiced as a science. That was Auguste Comte's entire focus in his idea was we need to study human society in a scientific fashion to begin to understand the laws governing human behavior and human interaction. So in order to do sociological research, we have to understand the scientific method. And it's a systematic, organized series of steps that ensures maximum objectivity and consistency regarding a research. When you're researching not just a problem, but researching behavior, researching human interaction, human activity. The scientific method in sociology, of course, when we talk about researching just kind of the state of matter, the state of existence in the natural sciences. It's not just researching a problem. So the first thing we need to do is define the problem, define what it is we're interested in researching. We have to operationalize our concept, coming up with an operational definition, which is an explanation of an abstract concept that becomes specific and measurable. That's what we're looking for. It's specific enough to allow researchers to assess the concept. Next thing we do would be reviewing the literature. We would be conducting what is referred to as a literature review, or creating an annotated bibliography for the research project we're involved in. What we're trying to do is we're trying to come up with a research model that allows us to move forward with researching the particular subject in which we're interested. So once we do this operationalization, then we can formulate our hypothesis, kind of becoming that specific, focused from a broader theoretical approach, say structural functionalism, social conflict, or symbolic interaction, which are more abstract in nature. we come up with specific hypotheses, which are kind of specific and measurable in the sense that we can go about gathering data to investigate the relationship within the hypotheses. We can talk about looking at the relationship between two variables. We say two or more factors known as variables. A variable is simply an object, a state of being, something that we're examining in the real world or the social world that has more than one fixed position. Something that only has one fixed position doesn't vary, so that would not really be a variable. It would be what we refer to as the constant in scientific nomenclature. A constant is something that doesn't vary. So we operationalize our abstract concept by coming up with definitions and variables to create a hypothesis that allows us to measure the variation and the relationship between variables. With regards to establishing a causal pathway between two variables, where we say that a change in X results in a change in Y, then we're establishing one as our independent variable and the other as our dependent variable. And the independent variable is the variable that causes a change in the dependent variable as it changes. So, continuing on with this idea of formulating the hypothesis, we have operationalized into variables our abstract concept. And we have our hypothesis, which is a proposed relationship between the two variables. We can look for a correlation between the two variables. A correlation simply means that a change in one variable is accompanied by a change in another variable. This is not saying that one variable is the independent variable and the other variable is the dependent variable. This is just looking for a relationship between a variable. And it can be a positive correlation, where as we observe an increase in X, we also observe an increase in Y. Or we can state it in the reverse fashion: as we observe an increase in Y, we also observe an increase in X. Or a negative correlation, which is as we observe an increase in X, we observe a decrease in Y. Or as we observe an increase in Y, we observe a decrease in X. So it's the reversal of the positive correlation, where an increase accompanies an increase. Causal logic involves establishing a causal pathway, saying that X is the variable that as it changes will cause Y, the variable, to change. One causes the other. That's the idea behind causal logic. One of the ways to establish causal logic is to, first of all, establish a correlation between two variables, to see that there is a relationship between two variables. And in order to do that, you also have to make sure that the relationship you're observing, or you're hypothesizing, is the relationship you're observing between the variables. There's not an intervening variable, another variable responsible for the variation in both. And then you establish a temporal pathway. We say that X comes before Y in time, therefore a change in X results in a change in Y, because Y follows X temporally. So we establish a temporal pathway. But we have to be careful not to also mistake the temporal pathway, mistake the causal relationship. For example, pardon me, there is an observed relationship between level of education and level of income. There is a positive correlation between higher levels of education and higher levels of income. So we can say that change in education will be accompanied by a change in income, or a change in income will be accompanied by a change in education. But it's fairly widely accepted and is the basis of the idea that education is a pathway to the middle class, ideologically. That education is the independent variable in that relationship, and level of income is the dependent variable in that relationship. In that, when we first pursue an increase in education, that results in an increase in income. It's not that we get a promotion at work and suddenly have acquired 2 more years of education in our brain and knowledge in our brain and another diploma in our office. It's that oftentimes the increase in education precedes either a promotion at work or getting a higher paying job. So that's how we can establish the causal pathway there. Now, the relationship between education and income is not as simple as that, and there are other intervening variables and other variables affecting that relationship. One is that affects the probability of getting education is parents' social class or level of income. Because if your parents are middle class, and if your parents come from a professional background, the chances are greater that you will attend college. Anyway, that's getting a little off topic here, but I'm just illustrating the idea of intervening variables, other variables. We can have like the relationship be a spurious relationship in the idea of if we set up an observation and record frequency of incidence in 2 particular variables, we could investigate the basis of the myth that storks bring babies by looking at frequency of reproduction, frequency of childbirth, and population of storks and any increase in the population of storks. This is also a great illustration, by the way, of what would be referred to as a spurious relationship, because there's actually another variable causing the variation in both the increase in storks and the increase in childbirth, in that in the wintertime, in medieval periods in Scandinavian countries, which is where this particular myth originates, it would be cold and dark during the winter. People would be staying indoors much more than they would during the spring and summer and fall. And so they would be spending a lot more time together. Couples would be more intimate and engage in more sexual activity. Storks like to nest on chimneys in the wintertime because of the heat generated from the fireplace. It's a warm place for them to nest and have eggs, lay eggs. And so it's actually the weather that causes both the increase in storks and the increase in fertility or childbirth incidence. But people started believing that storks brought babies because they'd see more storks appearing in the wintertime, and there'd be more babies towards the end of winter. So moving on, we've got our hypothesis. We are hypothesizing that, say, an increase in the level of education accompanies or will result in an increase in the level of income. Now what we have to do is we have to figure out how we're going to find out if people with higher levels of education do have higher levels of income. We could, in theory, ask every single person in the United States of America and crunch the numbers from the responses of roughly 300 million people. However, that would be very, very resource intensive in that it would consume a lot of time and probably consume quite a bit of money for travel and stuff like that as well. What we want to do, though, is figure out a way to select something that represents the population of the United States of America, but is more manageable in terms of size and being able to gather data. So what we do is we select a sample, which is a selection from a larger population that is statistically representative or typical of that population. And the way that we achieve a sample like that is by selecting really kind of a random sample, when every member of a population has the same chance of being selected. But if we're looking at something in the United States of America, when we're looking at education and income, if those are the only two variables, then to get a representative sample of the United States of America, we would just try to take a random sample. However, we might want to do a different kind of approach if we want to look at race and ethnicity and the interplay between education and income. Because there we're talking about different populations, and if we want to have a representative sample of the United States of America, what we would need to do is do a kind of cluster approach where we would select a random sample from each racial group in the United States of America, and then we would have the random samples be the size percentage-wise of those groups within the population. A lot of research is done through, just because it's easy to do it, especially with the internet and social media pages, what are called snowball samples. This is where you would recruit people through word of mouth, or you might post a survey on your Facebook page and ask all your Facebook friends to take it, or other social media like that. I can do surveys right here. I could do, a survey on attitudes towards particular social policies in this lecture. There's a function for that in this webinar platform. And that would be kind of a snowball sample, because it would be just word of mouth in this class, really. So we figured out how we're going to select our random sample and how we're going to make sure that it is truly a random sample, although that gets to be problematic. Because the more random or the more accurate you want your random sample to be, the more you have to invest time and resources in gathering it and trying to make sure that you get a high response rate. So we have our random sample. Now what we need to do is, using a method for gathering data, we have to ensure that the data we gather is going to be both valid and reliable, and hopefully as well generalizable to a larger population. Validity is quite simply the degree to which we are measuring what we think we want to measure. And reliability is the extent to which the method we are employing is reproducible if we replicate the experiment, or even if other people replicate the experiment using the method we used, will they come up with the same results? So validity is about the accuracy, and reliability is about being able to replicate the findings time and time again. And then generalizability would be, can we apply the results of the study we've done to a wider population? Whether, say, we're doing research in Northwest Indiana, can we apply that to all of Northern Indiana? Can we apply what we're doing to all of the United States of America? Have we sampled a wide enough population base to be able to apply it wider than just the people we have gathered data from? So we gather our data. Then we have to do an analysis of the data. We have to run, for doing quantitative data, what we would have to do is run kind of mathematical statistical analyses similar to like a linear regression or a probability, or a chi-square regression, or analysis of variance, things like that, where we're using mathematical formula to analyze relationships between between variables based upon frequency of response and things like that, looking for correlations. And then when we generate our hypothesis, what we're doing is we're actually generating two hypotheses at the same time. There's what's called the null hypothesis and the alternate hypothesis. The alternate hypothesis is the hypothesis that the data we've gathered is kind of reliable and gives evidence for supporting our hypothesis. Supporting the null hypothesis means that we're not supporting what we originally thought was going to happen, essentially. But when we talk about the scientific method, that's how it's conducted. You have actually two hypotheses generated, and you support either your alternate hypothesis, which would be your original hypothesis, or you support the null hypothesis, which means that what you thought was happening is not what your data indicates. Now, that does not mean that research that supports the null hypothesis is flawed or faulty or bad research, because even negative results scientifically are good, valid results, because you have created a hypothesis, but you have shown that this is not what's happening. One of the things we have to worry about, of course, is controlling for other factors. When I was an undergraduate, I did research on observation affecting behavior, and my hypothesis was that open observation of people coming from a symbolic interactionist perspective where it's about interpreting meanings, open observation of people would force them to alter their behavior. And the way I kind of operationalized that was looking at traffic behaviors at an intersection when there's a hidden observer that's not visible and an open observer that's visible recording something with a clipboard. And what I was looking at is how many people came to a full stop, rolling stop, or didn't even slow down at all. And of course the hypothesis was that the number of full stops would increase as the number of rolling stops and not even slowing down decreased when the condition was of open observation. In order to be sure that I was actually looking at this, the ideal thing would have been I would have been able to go back to the same intersection at the same time on the same day and record the same people traffic-wise Of course, we don't have that kind of technology. So the way that I tried to control the other variables to make sure I was actually looking at observation and behavior, the weathers had to be the same. It had to be the same time of day. It had to be the same day of the week. So that it wasn't darkness or difference in weather patterns or different traffic patterns owing to a different time of day or a different day of the week. People have different behaviors in rush hour versus weekend travel. So we have to control for other factors as well. These are referred to as control variables, and they're things that can vary but are held constant. So you're measuring the impact of the independent variable, in which would have been observation in the social experiment I just described, and behavior would have been the dependent variable. And so the condition of observation and then the condition of the stop representing the behavior. And so you can see that what I had done was design a kind of an experiment that detailed how I was going to gather the data, making sure that I controlled for certain things so that I was actually testing the hypothesis I had generated out of theory and looking to gather reliable and valid data. What I did was what's referred to as an experiment. There are a number of research methods that are used in sociology, including surveys, ethnography, experiments, and existing sources. Now, surveys, of course, everybody's kind of familiar with those. It's a study that kind of provides sociologists with people's opinions, behaviors, things, beliefs, values. And there are two ways of doing surveys. We have the interview and we have the questionnaire. The questionnaire is the one where you're filling it out. You have it on a printed piece of paper and you're just responding to answers. And the interview is where somebody, either on the phone or in a face-to-face setting, is asking questions that may be written down ahead of time, that may actually come from a form, and then recording the answers, either by writing them down or by recording the interview. Now, there are pluses and minuses to both of these. Questionnaire, minimal resources can allow you to gather responses from a large number of people. Interviews are more time consuming. In the time that you can do one interview, you could gather information from 100 people distributing questionnaires. However, in an interview, you can get richer, more detailed responses. You can ask follow-up questions. You can pursue leads. You can also usually get more detailed responses to open-end questions. Even if you include, first let me define what I'm talking about. Close-ended versus open-ended questions. Close-ended questions are questions where it's a one, maybe two-word response, and it's things like yes or no, or agree, neutral, disagree, that type of thing, where you're just picking a response that's one word or so. A lot of demographics, like if you ask people about age or age range, income range, these are what are referred to as close-ended questions. Open-ended questions are questions like that ask people for opinions about something, or ask people for feelings or thoughts about things, where they're asking for a more detailed, more in-depth answer. It's easier to get that in-depth, detailed answer to an open-ended question in an interview because people are much more willing to talk than they are to write. You can ask open-ended questions on surveys or on questionnaires, but if you ask too many of them, people will begin answering very, very tersely, and you'll basically get closed-ended question responses to open-ended questions. But what this kind of research method does is it allows you to create responses that can be kind of converted easily into numerical form, because you can run quantitative data analysis on the responses to questionnaires. Yes and no are coded very easily as 0 and 1 or 1 and 0. When you think about asking about attitudes, like what's called a Likert scale question, and that's the one where you have the strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree, is easily coded 1 through 5, and you can look for correlations between the responses to yes and no questions and Likert scale questions, or even looking like a demographic kind of like political affiliation, because you're not necessarily, what you're looking at is the correlation between the numeric value of various responses, and it shows you those kind of correlations. Qualitative research would be the more in-depth follow-up questions that you can't really convert easily into numeric form. Quantitative data can give you kind of a broad overview, broad view, but a somewhat superficial and surface view of people's attitudes. Like on a national scale, you can find out people's attitudes, surface attitudes towards a particular issue, but you would not be able to find out the in-depth kind of information about like their membership in social movements. Qualitative data tends to focus more on the meanings of what the people's behaviors are, what the actions are. Why do they have certain attitudes? We're looking for the meanings they're expressing. And so what we tend to find is that surveys tend to produce, kind of questionnaires tend to produce quantitative results, quantitative data. Interviews and what's referred to as ethnography or participant observation tend to produce more qualitative data. Ethnography or participant observation or field observation, there's actually 3 levels of kind of doing observation where you're in a setting taking notes. You can do field observation, which is just kind of observing behaviors in a public forum. Like if you wanted to observe, say, behavior between dog owners at a dog park, you would just go sit down in a dog park with a notebook and take notes. Then there's participant observation, which is you would actually try to join in a group to find out what it's like to be a member of that group on the inside. And then ethnography, which is an involved participant observation where you join a community for a period of 6 months to a year to try and get at a real deep understanding of what it means to be a member of that community. Produce qualitative results that aren't necessarily going to be generalizable. One of the things you can do with quantitative data and quantitative results is where you get to data that is more likely to be generalizable in nature and more able to be applied in a wider to a wider population. So we've got ethnography and observation, and I said there's two different levels of observation: field observation and participant observation. Experiments, I described one to you. One that everybody may be familiar with is Philip Zimbardo's famous Stanford prisoner guard experiment that gets discussed in psychology classes, in sociology classes, because it's such a great example of a social experiment. But that was very much in a controlled setting, and what you're trying to do with an experiment is control as much of the setting as possible so that you're actually able to measure the variation and the relationship between variables in your hypothesis. The best way to do this, and if we go back to the description of the research that I did regarding observation affecting behavior, we think about having the experimental group and the control group. In the case of my traffic observation experiment, the control group would have been the group that was observed when the observer was hidden, when they couldn't see the observer. And then the experimental group would be the group where the observer was standing out with a clipboard in the open recording something. Now, when we look at research that's been done, a lot of times there is an unintended influence of the researcher on the subject. The Hawthorne effect is named for a piece of research that was done at I believe it was a General Electric plant that was looking at how the level of light affected worker productivity. And so the researchers came in and they let everybody know that they were doing research, and they raised the level of light on the factory floor, and worker productivity increased. And they thought, well, this is good. We're getting results here. And so they lowered the level of light, and worker productivity increased again. And then they raised the level of light, and worker productivity increased marginally again. And everything they did, worker productivity increased. And the conclusion they finally came to was that it was the condition of being observed that was affecting the worker productivity, not the level of light. This led to an understanding of observer effects that was labeled the Hawthorne effect. There's also what can be referred to, pardon me for a second, I need to get a drink. Also what can be referred to as the white coat effect. And this is another type of research effect where what happens is that in order to make sure, and this is what comes in on the experiments effect on subjects. Subjects may decide to help the researcher out by making sure that they give the type of responses they think the researcher is looking for. We have to be careful for this type of effect as well. And it's a different type of effect that's referred to as the white coat effect, and it's when the subjects are trying to help the researchers out. But both the Hawthorne effect and the white coat effect are things that need to be observed and some care taken to prevent in social research. The white coat effect comes in, and the Hawthorne effect both kind of come in really during experiments, but also if you think about when you're doing participant observation, if you're not concealing your identity, although there is some research that indicates, similar to what happens on reality TV shows, where you see people always wondering, how could people act like that on camera? I could never be that way. You lose kind of the conscious awareness of the camera after you've you just become used to the effect of it. And there is some of that that goes on with participant observation as well, where they know that it's the researcher, but they stop inhibiting their behavior because of that, as they get conditioned to being exposed to a researcher being there. But it's still something we need to be cautious of, even with participant observation and ethnography, is that we may be having an unintended influence on the objects of our research. Another method is use of existing sources, and there's a wide range of what can be called existing sources. But secondary analysis is a research technique that makes use of previously collected and publicly accessible information and data. This kind of data can include data gathered by other researchers. If you just get in touch with them and ask them to get hold of their data set, it could be from like a university kind of collected data for social research, like what they have. I believe it's at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. If you remember, that's where Charles Horton Cooley was a sociologist. They do what's called the General Social Survey, and they gather responses to, I believe it's well over 600 or 700 questions from about 2,000 respondents every couple years, and it's a wide range of questions. And this research is made, or this data is made available to social researchers to use to do their own kind of data analysis on. You can use government census data. That is public data you can get access to at the community, federal, state, all different levels, and even like you can get access to EU data from the European Union, which looks at data from a multiplicity of nation states. All that government data is publicly accessible. Content analysis. Systematic coding and objective recording of data guided by some rationale can be done with a number of different types of cultural artifacts, such as music, songs, movies, books, TV shows. You can do content analysis on historical and documents and artifacts. So when we talk about existing sources, there's all kinds of existing sources out there. We can even look at doing what would be called sort of a metadata analysis, gathering a bunch of research articles on a particular topic and crunching kind of the research from all those articles to look at a metadata analysis of a particular kind of topic of research. In most institutions, especially academic institutions, but in most research institutions, and this applies to all different kinds of research, there will be what's called an internal review board, or an IRB. And it is this review board's responsibility to make sure that any kind of research done involving human subjects, involving living subjects, is done in an ethical fashion. When we look at like the American Sociological Association's Code of Ethics from 1977, we see a number of things here. Maintain objectivity and integrity in research. We need to practice sociology, as Max Weber said, with a value-neutral approach, where we do not allow our personal attitudes to influence or bias our research findings. We have to respect our subjects' right to privacy and dignity. We have to protect subjects from personal harm, preserve confidentiality, seek informed consent, acknowledge collaboration and assistance, and disclose sources of financial support. All of this is necessary for research to be kind of what you would call ethical research. We talk about confidentiality. We have to maintain anonymity for our human subjects, protecting their anonymity. And protecting their anonymity kind of goes beyond just not using a name. You can't use identifying features. So if you've seen my picture, I'm a tall, white, bald, and I shave my head bald. If you've heard my lectures, you know I'm loud. Full-time in sociology instructor at the Valparaiso campus. You will not have used my name, but if you use all that information in identifying a faculty member when you're doing research, you've pretty much identified me. So it goes beyond just non-confidentiality. Excuse me for 1 second. So, some other things to think about. Why do we disclose financial grants, where we've gotten financial sources? This avoids conflict of interest. If we are doing research on the effects of same-sex parents on children's psychological development, and our funding is coming from the National Organization for Marriage, which is an organization devoted to preserving marriage as a heterosexual institution, that can create a conflict of interest in our research, because it might influence our findings or our presentation of findings. Value neutrality, we mentioned that. We have to remain objective when we're doing social research. Okay. Mentioned this idea of the feminist methodology, and one of the things that happens often, and happened much oftener during the founding of sociology, was that sociology kind of assumed, like the male experience, and similarly to psychology, assumed the male experience as the norm. The feminist methodology, or the feminist perspective and approach, has had a great impact on the current generation of researchers, because what the methodology says is we have to treat female experiences as legitimate empirical data, sources of data. So we have to look broader than this assumption that, like if we think about Freud's concept of penis envy, that's something of a sexist attitude. Freud's saying that women have a problem because they don't have a penis and they want to have a penis. That's making the assumption that women essentially want to be men and the assumed norm is men. We need to get away from kind of ideas like that, and we need to, when we're doing social research, we need to take gender into account. So, feminist looks at work and family as closely integrated, draws attention to the fact that studies tend to overlook women. I'm talking about the assumption of the male perspective as the norm. Tend to involve and consult subjects more than other researchers. And it's more about doing what would be called kind of critical sociology, which is sociological research done with the intent of influencing policy decisions. So it's research done to affect social change. Duncan Watts is a researcher who looks at the effects. One of the pieces of research he's done is looking at the effects of kind of social awareness on popularity of cultural artifacts like songs or books or things like that. And he's done some research looking at how knowledge of other people's cultural selections or selection of cultural goods influences our selection of cultural goods. Some of the stuff like he talks about in there is, the reason that I go and see a Harry Potter movie is because I've seen the long lines of people going to see Harry Potter movies. I've heard people say that Harry Potter movie was great, and I've seen, other people saying that they wanted to go see the Harry Potter movie, and then that influences my behavior, and it's not really only about the quality of the movie. It's also about the number of people prior to me who have already, say, gone to see that movie, have consumed that particular social or cultural artifact. And the way that he did this research would have been impossible a decade ago, because what he did was he did internet research looking at how people's awareness of the popularity of songs influences their decision on which songs to download. And this research was done through the internet. And so if you think about it, really, 10 to 15 years ago, the internet would not have been sophisticated enough to allow you to do that kind of research. I mentioned you can get data from the European Union. You can get demographic data from the EU. And it's just a matter of going out and getting it on a website. However, as has become somewhat documented in certain news stories, data mining on the internet, gathering metadata on the internet, raises privacy concerns. Facebook has come under fire for some of the social data gathering and the uses to which they put that data. Companies gathering data on purchasing patterns to flood your email with ads. The government gathering metadata on phone calls, like where the call is going. Okay, so when we think about doing research on human sexuality, think about like how graphic the portrayal of sexual content has gotten. When we think about cable networks and especially the premium cable networks, it has gotten very graphic. If we think about shows like Game of Thrones, True Blood, The Sopranos, Boardwalk Empire, all of these are known for being very gritty and realistic shows, but part of what is included in that realism are portrayals of sex. So we think about that, but then when we just think about presentation of sexual content in sitcoms and references to acts of sex that have become commonplace in sitcoms, this may bother some people. Other people may think no big deal. The Kaiser Family Foundation is a foundation that kind of monitors TV content as a kind of a watchdog organization. So how would you go about carrying out research, scientific research, on this topic, which can be controversial? So if we think about it, there are a couple of famous researchers who have gathered data nationally on sexual behavior in the U.S., but there's not a whole lot of data that's been gathered on patterns of sexual behavior. There was the Kinsey report, and there was Masters and Johnson studies. Those are really the only two kind of widely available pieces of research on human sexuality. And anytime you think about government funding, it can be controversial for research. But researching sexual behavior is very controversial. We tend to be a very religious society, a much more religious society than the societies you find in other high-income industrialized nations. And so government funding for kind of like, if you got what's called an NSF, the National Science Foundation grant to research sexual behavior, that could be controversial, and it could be brought to the attention of politicians, and it could become politicized. So when we look at this, we saw that it did become politicized. In 1991, the U.S. Senate essentially forbid any kind of grant from the government for research on adult sexual practices. There is research that is being done. Laumann, Gagnon, Michaels, and Michael are looking at sexual practices of adults in the U.S. All of their funding is private because government funding, our Congress is a very conservative Congress at this point in time, and they are not going to fund that type of research. In fact, any kind of funding on other controversial topics could be problematic as well. Funding on research for evolution, funding on research for climate change, because we have a very conservative Congress right now. Okay, looking at statistics. We can talk about percentage. That shows portion of 100. If we talk about a probability, there we're talking about a portion of 1. But percentage and probability are revealing the same kind of information. It's just that, you look at 100% as the totality of it. A probability of 1 is the totality. It means that something will absolutely occur, but has a probability of 1. We have the mean, which is the average. These are terms we use when we're looking at numbers from research, and we're kind of analyzing them statistically. We've got 3 ways of looking at kind of the center point of a group of variable responses. We've got the mean, we've got the mode, and we've got the median. Now, these can be very, very different because of the way that each of them are calculated. The mode is simply the single most common value in a series of values. So if we take a number set like 1, 1, 1, 2, 3, what we're going to find is that when we add those numbers together, we've got 5 numbers there. And it comes out to 8 when we add the sum, and then we divide 8 by 5, and we come up with 1.6 is what it comes out to. So the mean would be 1.6 of the number set 1123. 11123. The mode would be 1, as would the median, because the median simply takes the midpoint number. The median is, if you have five numbers, it's the third of 5, because that's the one that's in between. The mode is the single most common value. So if we have, say, a larger number set, and we have 1, 2, 2, 2, 3, 5, 7, 9, 17. The average of that is going to be, the mean is going to be higher than the mode, because the mode is going to be the number 2. That's the single most common value. We had 1, 2, 2, 2, 3, 5, 7, 9, 17. There's 9 numbers in there. So we had 1, 2, 2, 2, 3. 3 would be the median. And we have 1, 2, 2, 2, 3, 5, 7, 9, and 17. If we add all those together, 1, 2, 2, 2, so 7, 3 is 10, and 17 is 27, and 9 is 36, and 12 is 48, and 48 divided by 9 is going to be 5.3 roughly. And so our mean would be 5.3, our mode would be 2, and our median would be 3. 3 different ways of looking at a set of numbers. Okay, so those are the way we kind of interpret what statistics are trying to tell us. Reading graphs and tables and charts, they're all presenting information of some type, and the reason we use tables, charts, and graphs is they present a summary of information in a way that's quickly readable. It allows social scientists to display data and make it easier to develop conclusions. A table, we can do cross-tabulation on a table, having values running down the y and across the x-axis, and that allows us to kind of show relationships between variables. Graphs show us things that the number of individual points, and we can look for kind of like on a graph, a linear regression graph will show us the median line there. Now, why do we do all this? Well, all this leads up to actually writing and publishing research. That's why we do research, so we can publish it. We got to write a research report. Find information, textbooks, do research in library catalogs, use computerized periodical indexes, examine government documents, newspapers, people, organizations, and informations, instructor, reference librarian, all kinds of different ways of finding information. So, if you happen to take the Sociology 252, you'll be doing some of this. There's a research paper as part of that course for the online course. So you write the report, focus on your topic, develop an outline, work ahead of the deadline. Don't wait till 2 hours before a paper is due to sit down and try and start writing it. Read the paper aloud. That's the last thing you want to do. Some other things actually that you might want to do is you might want to have somebody proofread it for you, a friend, an acquaintance. Just get a fresh pair of eyes to look at it. Look at anything that Word as a word processor highlights for you with spell check and grammar check. But reading it aloud will also enable you to hear anything that doesn't sound quite right, and will enable you to figure out how to help you to figure out how to fix it. So, okay, that's chapter 2. Research methods. Now we're going to be moving on to chapter 3, culture. And some of the things we're going to be looking at in this chapter, talking about what is culture, taking a look at development of culture around the world, examine cultural variation, talk about the role of language, norms and values, global culture war, looking at kind of what could be called the culture at Walmart, and then examine the interaction between culture and social policy when we look at the idea of bilingualism and bilingual education. Questions we're going to be trying to answer. How basic is the study of culture to sociology? What general cultural practices, or what we would call kind of cultural universals, are found in all societies? And, we'll also take a look at the wide variations that distinguish one society from another. What are the major aspects of culture? What are, kind of what goes into making up culture? How do cultures develop what's referred to as a dominant ideology? And then take a look at what culture means from a conflict and a functionalist perspective. So when we think about culture, culture can be thought of as that which gives continuity to human existence. It's actually culture that kind of allows us to pass down what it means to be human. It's the totality of behaviors and attitudes coupled with material objects that shape our way of life. Culture is that which precedes us, that which follows us, and that which gives human existence continuity, as I said. So it includes these ideas, values, customs, and artifacts of a group of people. Culture is endemic to a society. And society is a group of people kind of living in a geographically bounded region who are somewhat or relatively independent of the people outside that area, participate in a common culture. So like everybody living in the United States of America shares kind of a culture, the culture of the United States of America. And while it may have similarities to the culture of England and the culture of Australia and the culture of Canada, there are variations in those cultures. And each society is separate and has kind of its own culture. Culture is what allows us to interact as human beings. And common culture simplifies like day-to-day interactions. We don't have to kind of create meaning every time we want to communicate with somebody else. Our culture has kind of meanings embedded in it that we can use in day-to-day interactions. Theodor Adorno was a sociologist who kind of did a lot of work looking at culture, cultural production, cultural consumption, and this idea of the worldwide culture industry as standardized goods and services demanded by consumers, and how it limits the availability of choice to people. Because what we have to choose is limited by what our culture and what the global culture offers us in terms of choices for consumption. So when we're talking about culture industry, we're talking about like the cultural artifacts, the movies, music, computers, all this kind of stuff produced, standardized goods and services, the idea of fast food, and how going to a restaurant is becoming a homogeneous experience. You can go to a McDonald's pretty much anywhere in the world now. But going to McDonald's, if McDonald's takes over and is the only choice we have for restaurants, because that's what the standardized good for, as far as restaurant is we want, then that limits what we have to choose to what's available on McDonald's menu. So we talked about these ideas of cultural universals. Practices and beliefs that are cultural institutions too that exist among all societies. So some of these things might include like politics as an institution, education, family, all these, they differ in what each is, and they vary from culture to culture to culture, but there's kind of an idea of these institutions in every culture. Religion exists, politics, health and medicine, science and technology. They may exist at different levels and be completely different things, but they exist in some form in society and can be thought of as cultural universals. There are also like cultural prohibitions that can be universals, like universal taboos, the incest taboo, the prohibition against murder. They're defined differently by different cultures, like what constitutes murder or what constitutes incest. But they exist in some fashion or another, kind of in all societies. And a lot of them are adapted around essential human needs. I mean, social institutions are kind of stable patterns of behavior replicated across time that center around basic human needs. The family, the economy, politics, these control the distribution and production of certain things in society. Like the family is a social institution that is the institution in our society responsible for producing new members. The only place we get new members of society is from the family. Politics distributes power in a society. The economy is where goods and services are produced, distributed, and consumed. They vary from culture to culture to culture, but they exist in some fashion or another, kind of in all cultures. We grow up within a culture. So as we grow up, our natural assumption is that that culture is kind of the right and proper and good way to live. It's what feels natural and normal to us. However, this is an attitude kind of referred to as ethnocentrism. And, viewing our culture as good is not necessarily a bad thing unless we start to believe that it's better than everybody else's culture. That's when ethnocentrism becomes a bad thing. We have to make an attempt to view people's behavior with respect to the culture in which the behavior is produced and what the norms of behavior are in that culture. Now, that's not to say that if there's a particular culture out there practicing cannibalism, we just say, okay, well, that's just their particular thing. We don't want to go too far excusing behavior. But if we think about something like the idea that it's okay to eat cow, but eating dog is a bad thing. If you remember, when we talk about like the sociological imagination, which allows us to view behaviors, or the sociological perspective, which allows us to view behaviors stripped of their culture. Eating cow and eating dog, same basic behavior. Consumption of meat of another animal for sustenance of life. The variation is cultural. In our society, dogs are pets, cows are food. In Indian society, cows are divine and shouldn't be eaten. Chickens are food, and they will eat more chicken than they won't eat cows, though. The majority of the population. In China, dog is actually a delicacy in some regions. So we don't want to say that, oh, well, because we don't eat dog, our culture is superior. Our cuisine is superior to a cuisine where dog is food. We got to judge that by the standards of that culture. Herbert Spencer was a 19th century sociologist who had this idea of what he called social Darwinism. This was sort of like the foundations of sociobiology, which is the study of how biology affects human social behavior. Now, what's being done currently is very different from what Spencer was talking about in his sociocultural evolution. It is actually Herbert Spencer that gave us the term survival of the fittest, because he believed that individuals within a society we're in a state of competition, and the kind of best individuals in that society rose to the top. And that's where he got this idea of survival of the fittest. Spencer also kind of applied this when looking at societies. Some societies are further along the evolutionary path than others. We talk about level of technology, but we tend not to assign that value judgment of being more or less evolved when we're comparing societies anymore. We can say that some societies have a greater level of technology as part of their culture than other societies, but we don't say that that makes them better. Anyway, what sociobiologists today are looking at is how genetics, the genetic code, affects behavior and determines behavior. And sociobiologists are saying that within our genetic code may be the answers for why we act certain ways. And why many of our cultural traits exist as they do is because it's rooted in genetic makeup. So they're focused on how human nature is affected by the genetic makeup of people who share characteristics. Sociobiologists, for a lot of other social scientists, may be going too far. There is a biological basis for social behavior. I don't think any sociologist would dispute that. But the idea that all of our cultural traits will be located within some gene, some combination of genetic makeup, there's not nearly as much support for those ideas. The entire idea of sociology is that there are rules governing social interaction, and that the way that we're socialized affects the way that our individual personality and selves develop. So it's the whole nature versus nurture debate. Most social scientists feel that the extreme position of sociobiology goes too far towards the nature portion and doesn't give enough credence for the nurture portion. So sociobiologists are looking at development of culture, but when we talk about culture, we also look at how does culture develop around the world. Okay, one way that culture develops is what's called innovation. A new idea, a new object to culture. One of the first, what you would call sort of technological innovations for human beings was fire, taming fire, using fire. But there are two types of innovation. There's discovery and invention. Discovery is making known or sharing existence of an aspect of reality. From the European perspective, Columbus sort of discovered the Americas. And that changed a lot of things in Europe and changed a lot of things in the Americas. Invention is kind of technological innovation in that it's creating a new way of combining resources into a form that didn't exist before. So culture, like computer, is an invention. And the technology in a computer is not the computer, the components themselves. The technology is the knowledge of how to take plastics and metals and silicone and all this stuff and put it together into a computer. So you take existing cultural items and combine them in a new form. The internal combustion engine took the ideas of the steam engine, but just used gasoline to do it. And kind of changed transportation. And then another way that cultural ideas can spread is this idea of diffusion, in which cultural ideas that may have originated in one society spread to other societies. George Ritzer was a sociologist who gave us the idea of McDonaldization. Certain principles developed within the fast food industry at McDonald's dominate certain sectors of society. if you can think about like the principles governing the way that customer interaction is handled at McDonald's and goods are delivered to customers at McDonald's, and the way that uh, the skill set required to work at McDonald's has been kind of stripped down and de-skilled. We can see this beginning to go into other areas of society, in which professions that used to be considered skilled labor have kind of been McDonaldized, which is to say de-skilled, and the menu of offerings kind of somewhat simplified. As I said, Gerhard Lenski has this idea. He also developed this idea of sociocultural evolution. But what he's looking at there is kind of the level of technology. And technology, according to Nolan and Lenski, this is where we get this definition of technology that we use in sociology, is knowledge of how to use resources available in a society to put together objects to satisfy human needs and desires. So, like I said, one of the first technological innovations, fire, took something that could be used only as a club or maybe a spear, wood, and turned it into a source of light, a source of heat, a source of cooking for food. So it really kind of, fire was used then to satisfy human needs and desires. We think about culture. We've got material and non-material culture. Material culture are the physical or technological aspects of daily lives, like food, the cuisine is part of physical culture. Computers, homes, factories, raw materials, and then non-material culture, customs, beliefs, philosophies, values, behaviors, patterns of communication, governments. These are all kind of abstract ideas in a certain sense. They exist in a non-material fashion. Culture lag, period of maladjustment, when non-material culture struggles to adapt to new material conditions. We see this going on right now with regards to intellectual property and the internet, because it is so easy to pirate intellectual property on the internet. Right now, governments are trying to figure out how to regulate the internet, and people are trying to figure out how to protect intellectual property on the internet without beginning to create censorship on the internet and reduce functionality of the internet. So the computers in the internet have created new material conditions that our non-material culture is still struggling to adapt to. Subculture is a particular segment of a society that shares culture with each other that is not shared by the wider society. Mores, folkways, values, and that's not mores, that's mores. Mores are kind of like norms. When you talk about norms, norms are expectations of proper behavior within society. And you've got mores and folkways, and mores kind of are the big norms, folkways are the little norms. Values are judgments about what is good and right and proper. Subculture is a particular part of culture that shares distinctive patterns of all these things. And it also may share an argot, a specialized language that distinguishes a subculture from the wider society. If we think about hospitality workers, a lot of times they can be viewed as a subculture. They are set aside from society. They kind of share patterns of social life and drug and alcohol use that vary from the wider society. And I say this with knowledge developed from working in that business for 20 to 25 years. that alcohol consumption is much higher within restaurant workers, and there has been some research that documented that it is one of the segments of society that has higher alcohol consumption than other segments of society on an ongoing basis. But they are set apart in large part by work hours. They're physically set apart from the larger society because when the larger society is kind of relaxing, going out to meals and stuff like that and enjoying time off, that's when hospitality workers are working. So, and they also do have an argot. Those of you who may have worked in restaurants may recognize the term 86ing something, which means you no longer have it available to offer for customers. There are other things, front of the house, back of the house, kind of stuff that is part of the argot of working in restaurants. But it could also be something like a group that chooses to set themselves apart through distinctive dress or distinctive music, like the Gothic subculture or the steampunk subculture, both of which involve elements of wardrobe and music. Now, those are just subcultures. Counterculture is a specific type of subculture. It's a subculture that opposes and actually develops values that are in direct opposition to the values of the wider culture. The idea of the hippie generation and the free love that they experienced, and that was one of the values they had, was in direct opposition to the value of monogamy and committed relationships of the wider, larger culture. If you had a little shudder run up your back when I said sit down to a nice meal of dog, in a small way you have experienced culture shock. If you've ever traveled to another country and found certain of the behaviors somewhat disconcerting, you have felt culture shock. Culture shock is feeling disoriented, uncertain, out of place, or fearful when immersed in an unfamiliar culture. If you've traveled to parts of Latin America or the Caribbean or even into Canada, which is very similar to our culture but does have differences, or been to Europe or Africa or other places in the world, there's a lot of cultural variation. And when that makes you feel disoriented, fearful, uncertain, out of place, that's culture shock. Language. Language is a big part of culture because language is how we communicate our cultural ideas. It's an abstract system of symbols that help us communicate our culture. So we have word meanings and symbols. Now, language consists of written and spoken language, and it consists of verbal and nonverbal communication. But the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is the idea that the language we learn and the definitions we learn, the meanings we learn for the words in our language shape the way that we think. Because language precedes thought, language is culturally determined, so language shapes the way we think about concepts. Can also shape how we see, taste, smell, feel, and hear. Does coffee really taste good? Or is our language about coffee and the way that we hear coffee referred to in our language and our culture shaping the way that we feel about coffee? Just something to think about. But the whole idea here is when we think about a word and the meaning of a word like freedom, what are we talking about? Because freedom means a whole bunch of different things. Freedom can mean the freedom to act. Freedom can mean freedom from want. When we talk about having freedom in the United States of America, we're not talking about freedom from want. We're talking about freedom of action. We have the freedom to choose what we're going to do. And to us, being free means freedom to choose your actions. It doesn't mean freedom from want, which is an entirely different kind of freedom. It doesn't mean freedom from harm either, which is another kind